Early that morning, the heavy thud of a fist against my front door shattered the quiet of my home. I opened it to find a deputy sheriff holding a formal eviction notice with my name on it. Across the street, my own son-in-law leaned against a brand-new Porsche, laughing and holding up his phone to record me. "Hurry up, old man," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crisp Oklahoma air. "This house is ours now." I did not yell. I did not panic. I calmly looked at the papers and asked the officer one single question. His face went instantly pale. "Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against family who mistook your kindness for weakness." My name is Nathaniel Reyes. I am 70 years old, a former petroleum chief engineer, and a widower living on a 5-acre property just outside of Cardell, Oklahoma. It was a Tuesday. I remember the rich, dark smell of the coffee I had just finished brewing in the kitchen. The morning sun was barely breaking over the horizon, painting the suburban sky in beautiful shades of burnt orange and pale purple. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, isolated morning my late wife and I used to sit on the porch and enjoy together. But that familiar peace was violently torn away by the relentless pounding at my front door. I set my ceramic mug down on the granite counter, wiping my calloused hands on a dish towel. When I opened the heavy oak door, Deputy Halloran stood there on my welcome mat. I knew Halloran. He was a decent young man who grew up just a few miles down the road. But today, he refused to meet my eyes. He shifted his weight uncomfortably from side to side, clutching a manila folder tight against his uniform chest. "Mr. Reyes," he started, his voice unusually tight and formal. "I am really sorry to have to do this to you." He held out a thick stack of legal papers. The bold black letters at the top spelled out "Court-ordered notice of eviction." I reached out and took the document. The paper felt heavy in my hands, loaded with a profound betrayal I had spent my entire life trying to shield my family from. I did not immediately read the fine print. Instead, my eyes drifted past the nervous deputy, looking out over the sprawling green lawn that I had meticulously cared for over the past 3 decades. Parked illegally across the street, resting halfway on the grass, was a gleaming midnight black Porsche. Leaning casually against the hood was Wesley Thorne, my 42-year-old son-in-law. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, looking every bit the self-proclaimed startup entrepreneur he always pretended to be in front of my friends. He was holding his smartphone high in the air, the camera lens pointed directly at my front porch. He was laughing loudly, a cruel, echoing sound that carried easily over the gentle morning breeze. He wanted to capture my humiliation on video. He wanted to broadcast my ruin to the world. "Get your bags packed, old man," he shouted across the pavement, grinning from ear to ear. I told you your time was up. Standing right beside him, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, was Priscilla, my own daughter. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the woman whose college tuition, lavish wedding, and countless financial emergencies I had quietly funded without ever asking for a dime in return. She wore a pristine white blazer, her makeup flawless, her expression hardened into a cold, calculating smirk. She is a 38-year-old real estate agent, someone who knows exactly how property laws work. She avoided looking me directly in the eye, keeping her gaze fixed on the front steps, but the slight, satisfied curve of her lips told me everything I needed to know. She was fully complicit in this nightmare. She was actively enjoying it. I looked down at the wooden planks beneath my boots. 30 years ago, I drove every single nail into this porch with my own 2 hands. I spent entire weekends measuring, cutting, and sanding the solid oak so that Priscilla would have a safe place to play with her dolls. I built this house from the ground up to be a permanent fortress for my family. Now my own flesh and blood was waiting across the street for me to be dragged out of it by law enforcement, expecting me to leave with nothing but the clothes on my back, and perhaps a single suitcase. They thought they had successfully backed an old, helpless man into a corner. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. I spent my entire professional career managing massive offshore oil rigs. I was a chief engineer, responsible for billion-dollar operations in the middle of the unforgiving ocean. My daily job was to analyze incredibly complex structures, anticipate catastrophic failures, and mitigate lethal risks before they happened. I am thoroughly trained to spot structural flaws, whether they exist in a deep-water drilling platform or in the greedy people standing right in front of me. I do not panic under pressure. I observe, I calculate, I survive. And right now, looking at the smug grin on Wesley's face and the cold indifference in Priscilla's posture, I felt any remaining fatherly warmth evaporate completely from my chest. The generous man who had patiently funded their extravagant lifestyle, the grieving widower who had tried to keep the family peace at all costs, was gone. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft. They wanted to use the law as a weapon to strip away my dignity. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited a veteran shark to the table. I looked back at Deputy Halloran. He was practically holding his breath, bracing himself for the screaming, the tears, and the desperate denial that usually accompanied a morning eviction. I slowly adjusted my glasses and calmly reviewed the first page of the notice. It stated clearly that the property had been foreclosed upon under the authority of Thorn Holdings, which was Wesley's primary corporate entity. I let out a soft, dry chuckle. Halloran blinked, thoroughly confused by my strangely calm reaction. I tapped the heavy paper with my index finger and finally broke the silence. "Officer Halloran," I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely devoid of fear. "I have a very simple question for you before you proceed." He nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Go ahead, Mr. Reyes." I pointed toward the official seal on the document. This eviction notice was filed by Thorn Holdings, claiming full ownership of my land. But are you aware that this entire 5-acre property was locked securely into an irrevocable blind trust back in 2018? Selling it, transferring it, or leveraging it is legally impossible for anyone, including myself. So I need you to tell me exactly what forged, fraudulent document my son-in-law used to bypass a federal judge to get you standing on my porch today. Halloran stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might pass out right there on the wood. His hand drifted unconsciously away from his utility belt. He realized in a terrifying fraction of a second that he was not executing a routine property eviction. He had just been weaponized in a massive federal crime, and he was standing right in the blast zone. The young deputy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, as his eyes darted from the heavy manila folder in his hands to the smug face of my son-in-law across the street. He looked back at me, his uniform suddenly seeming 2 sizes too large. "Sir, I just simply process the orders the county clerk hands me," he stammered, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. The paperwork had a judge's signature. It all looked standard. I kept my posture relaxed, offering him a steady, reassuring nod. "I know you do, son," I said gently. "But standard paperwork does not apply to assets secured in an irrevocable blind trust. A judge would only sign an eviction order if someone presented a deed proving a legal transfer of ownership. And since I cannot legally transfer this land, whoever filed this order committed perjury and presented forged documents to a federal court." Halloran looked down at the folder again, his hands actually trembling now. He was a good kid, just doing his job, and he recognized the gravity of what I was telling him. If he proceeded to force me out of my home based on fraudulent corporate documents, he would be actively participating in a major federal crime. He stepped back from my doorway, creating a respectful distance. "Mr. Reyes, what do you want me to do here?" he asked, completely abandoning his authoritative stance. "I want you to hold on," I replied softly, leaning against the doorframe. "Do not radio this in just yet. Do not approach the vehicle across the street. Just stand here on the porch with me for a moment, and let them think they have won." Halloran nodded slowly, turning his back to the street, so Wesley and Priscilla could not see the sheer panic written across his features. Across the asphalt, Wesley was still holding his phone high, capturing what he thought was the moment of my total destruction. Priscilla was whispering something in his ear, a cruel smile playing on her lips. They were absolutely convinced they had executed the perfect crime. They believed they had outsmarted a senile old man who was too trusting for his own good. As I stood there watching my own daughter celebrate my ruin, my mind drifted away from the crisp morning air. I needed to focus, to remember exactly how this elaborate trap had been set. To understand the sheer depth of their betrayal, you have to understand the night this nightmare truly began. It was not born out of sudden malice. It was carefully crafted with tears, manipulation, and a profound abuse of a father's love. The foundation of their deception was laid exactly 4 months prior, on a miserable, rainy Tuesday night in late November. I was sitting in my leather recliner, reading an engineering journal, when the doorbell rang frantically. It was past midnight. I opened the door to find Priscilla and Wesley standing on my porch, soaked from the rain and looking entirely devastated. Priscilla was weeping uncontrollably, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Wesley stood beside her, looking like a man who had just lost everything. I brought them inside, handed them warm towels, and made tea. Wesley sat at my kitchen table, staring at his hands. He told me his tech startup was on the brink of total collapse. He claimed a former business partner filed a malicious lawsuit against him, freezing all his corporate assets. He said the legal fees were draining them dry, and without a massive survival loan from the bank within the week, they would lose their home and face absolute ruin. Priscilla reached across the oak table and grabbed my hands. Her fingers were ice cold. She looked into my eyes with a desperation that broke my heart. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly. "We have nowhere else to turn. The bank will not give us the loan because Wesley's assets are frozen. They need to see substantial collateral to approve the funding. If we do not get this money, we are going to be out on the street. Mom always told you to protect me. Please do not let us lose everything." Hearing her invoke her late mother's name was like taking a physical blow to the chest. My wife had been the heart of our family, and on her deathbed, holding my hand, she had made me promise to always look out for our little girl. Priscilla knew exactly what buttons to push. She knew that my grief was a quiet, lingering shadow, and she weaponized it with surgical precision. I asked them what they needed me to do. I told them I could liquidate some mutual funds, maybe give them a cash loan to tide them over. Wesley shook his head, running a hand through his damp hair. "Cash will not help right now, Nathaniel," he said, sounding incredibly exhausted. "The bank needs to see long-term appreciating collateral, backing my corporate portfolio. We just need to temporarily park the management rights of this property under my holding company." I frowned, instantly cautious. I told them I could not do that, explaining the 5 acres were my sanctuary. Wesley was quick to reassure me, holding his hands up defensively. "No, Nathaniel, you do not understand. We do not want ownership. We just want to establish a family limited liability company. It is a common strategy to avoid massive estate taxes when you pass away. We transfer management rights to the LLC, which shows up as managed equity. The bank sees the backing, approves my loan, and you avoid future death taxes. You keep living here. Nothing changes." It sounded incredibly plausible. The American tax system is notoriously brutal on inherited wealth, and setting up a family management corporation is a standard practice for protecting generational assets. Wesley spoke with the smooth, convincing jargon of an experienced businessman. Priscilla continued to cry, squeezing my hands, begging me to save her future. I looked at my daughter, seeing the terrified little girl I had raised, completely unaware that I was looking at a predator, setting a trap for her own father. Against my better judgment, I agreed, telling them to bring the paperwork the next morning. I thought I was doing the right thing, honoring my wife's dying wish to protect our family. I had no idea I had just agreed to sign my own death warrant. The next day, Wesley returned with a thick stack of documents and a quiet notary. I read the first few pages detailing the family corporation, and it aligned with our discussion. I signed my name completely blind to the lethal document slipped into the center of the pile. That was 4 months ago. Now I stood on my porch with Deputy Halloran, watching Wesley and Priscilla wait for me to be discarded. The rain and manipulative tears from that November night were gone. I knew the truth now. They did not need a family management company to save their business. They needed total ownership to fund their greed, and they stole it right out from under me, without an ounce of remorse. I remember every agonizing detail of that midnight visit. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, sweeping across the Oklahoma plains with a fierce intensity. Heavy rain lashed against the windows of my home, accompanied by the low, continuous rumble of thunder. I was sitting in my leather recliner in the study, reading a technical engineering journal, by the warm glow of a desk lamp, enjoying the solitude that usually accompanied such weather. Then the frantic ringing of the doorbell shattered the quiet. It was far too late for casual visitors. I set my journal down, a knot of genuine concern tightening in my chest, and made my way to the front door. When I opened it, the howling wind blew rain onto the hardwood floor. Standing there on my porch, completely soaked and looking entirely broken, were my daughter, Priscilla, and my son-in-law, Wesley. Priscilla was shivering uncontrollably, her expensive coat clinging to her shoulders, her mascara running down her pale cheeks in dark, messy streaks. Wesley looked like a man who had not slept in days. His usually immaculate hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were red and frantic. I did not ask questions right away. My instinct as a father immediately took over. I ushered them inside out of the freezing rain, locked the heavy oak door against the storm, and led them straight to the kitchen. I handed them warm, dry towels from the laundry room and quickly set a kettle on the stove. The entire time, Priscilla continued to weep, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with heavy, dramatic sobs. Wesley sat at the head of my kitchen table, gripping a steaming mug of tea as if it were a lifeline. He stared blankly at the polished wood, playing the role of a completely defeated man to absolute perfection. I pulled out a chair opposite him, watching my daughter wipe her eyes with a paper towel. I asked them calmly to tell me exactly what was wrong. Wesley took a deep, shuddering breath, looking at me with eyes full of fabricated despair. He explained that his highly touted technology startup was on the brink of total catastrophic collapse. He claimed that a former disgruntled business partner had filed a massive malicious lawsuit against the company. According to Wesley, this lawsuit had triggered an automatic legal injunction, freezing all of his corporate bank accounts and personal assets. He told me the legal fees to fight the injunction were bleeding them dry. He painted a terrifying picture of impending ruin, stating that if he could not secure a substantial corporate survival loan from a major bank, by the end of the week, the company would fold, they would lose their home, and they would be left with absolutely nothing. He sounded so incredibly convincing, using complex financial terms and projecting a vulnerability I had never seen in him before. I listened patiently, processing the information, just as I would analyze a failing pressure valve on an oil rig. But before I could formulate a logical solution, Priscilla made her move. She reached across the wide oak table, her cold, damp fingers desperately clutching my hands. She looked deeply into my eyes, and the sheer terror on her face looked devastatingly real. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking in the quiet kitchen. "We have absolutely nowhere else to turn. Every door has been slammed in our faces. The bank will not even look at us, because Wesley's assets are locked up in court. We are going to lose the house. We are going to be out on the street." Then she delivered the fatal blow, the psychological strike she knew would dismantle my logical defenses. "Mom always told you to protect me, Dad," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. "She made you promise to never let me fall. Please do not let us lose everything we have worked so hard for." Hearing her invoke her late mother's memory was like taking a physical blow straight to the chest. My beautiful wife had been the absolute heart and soul of our family. In her final days, holding my hand tightly in the sterile hospital room, she had looked at me with fading eyes and made me swear to always look out for our little girl. Priscilla knew exactly how heavy that promise weighed on my heart. She knew my grief was a quiet, lingering shadow, and she weaponized it against me with surgical, ruthless precision. My protective instincts overwhelmed any lingering skepticism. I looked at my weeping daughter and the seemingly crushed man beside her. I told them to breathe, assuring them I would not let them lose their home. I offered to immediately liquidate a significant portion of my mutual funds. I told them I could write a personal check, a substantial cash loan, to tide them over until the malicious lawsuit was settled and their corporate accounts were unfrozen. But Wesley quickly shook his head, running a nervous hand through his damp hair. "Cash will not solve the structural problem right now, Nathaniel," he said, sounding incredibly weary. "The bank examiners do not want a temporary cash injection. They need to see long-term appreciating collateral backing my corporate portfolio. They need a solid, tangible asset on the books to approve the massive funding required to save the company." I frowned, my engineering mind immediately raising a red flag. I told them plainly that I could not offer my property as collateral, explaining that this 5-acre estate was my permanent sanctuary and the legacy I intended to leave behind. Wesley was quick to reassure me, holding his hands up defensively in a gesture of complete submission. "No, Nathaniel. You misunderstand our intentions entirely," he insisted softly. "We do not want ownership of your home. We would never ask you to risk your sanctuary. We merely want to establish a family limited liability company, a very standard financial vehicle." He smoothly explained that we would just temporarily park the management rights of the property under his holding company. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a tone of professional confidentiality. He claimed this was a common strategy, designed to help me avoid massive estate taxes when I passed away. He explained that transferring the management rights to the new corporate entity would allow the property to show up as managed equity on his balance sheet. The bank would see the solid backing, approve his emergency loan, and I would simultaneously avoid future death taxes that could drain my estate. "You keep living here exactly as you always have," he promised, looking me squarely in the eye. "Nothing changes for you, but you save our lives in the process." It sounded incredibly plausible. The American tax system is notoriously brutal on inherited wealth, and setting up a family management corporation is a widely accepted practice for protecting generational assets. He spoke with the smooth, convincing jargon of an experienced businessman, masking a deadly trap behind the illusion of fiscal responsibility and familial love. I simply did not see the sharp, poisonous hook hidden inside their desperate plea. The very next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a deceptively bright and clear Oklahoma sky. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring my first cup of black coffee, when the heavy tires of Wesley's leased SUV crunched onto my gravel driveway. He did not come alone. Accompanying him was a man he introduced as his corporate notary, a nervous, sweaty individual named Marlin, who looked like he had not slept in a week. Marlin wore an ill-fitting cheap gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He clutched a thick leather briefcase to his chest, as if it contained state secrets, his eyes darting around my home with an unsettling mix of curiosity and greed. Normally, my instincts would have flared at the sight of such an unprofessional character handling sensitive financial matters. In my years managing engineering contracts, I had dealt with top-tier legal professionals, men and women of impeccable bearing, but my mind was clouded by the raw, lingering image of my daughter, weeping on my floor, just hours prior. I was playing the role of the tired, grieving father, exhausted by the emotional toll of the night before, and desperate to restore peace to my family. I simply wanted Priscilla to stop crying. I wanted to fulfill the final promise I had made to my late wife. Wesley guided Marlin to the large oak dining table, gesturing for him to open the briefcase. Marlin unlatched the brass clasps and pulled out a formidable stack of legal documents, placing them squarely in front of my chair. Wesley stood behind him, hovering over the table with a tense, coiled energy. He wore a practiced smile, but I could see a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Nathaniel," Wesley said, his tone smooth and deeply respectful, "I cannot thank you enough for doing this. We had our legal team draft these overnight to ensure we hit the bank's deadline. As we discussed, this is strictly the formation of the Family Limited Liability Company and the authorization transferring the management rights of this estate into the corporate portfolio." He pointed to the top page, his manicured finger tracing a line of dense, convoluted legal text. He launched into a highly technical explanation of American estate tax codes, tossing around terms like generational wealth transfer, asset protection shields, and fiduciary management buffers. It all sounded remarkably sophisticated. The logic of avoiding massive inheritance taxes upon my eventual passing made perfect sense on the surface. It is a common strategy utilized by wealthy families across the country to protect their assets from the federal government. I had no reason to suspect that a man who sat at my Thanksgiving table for 10 years was using legitimate tax strategies as a smokescreen for outright theft. I sat down at the table, picking up the heavy brass pen Marlin had nervously set down. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to flip through the pages. There were at least 50 pages of dense, single-spaced text. I read the first few sections carefully. They detailed the creation of Thorne Family Holdings and outlined my role as a passive beneficiary, while Wesley assumed the role of managing director. It was exactly what we had discussed. It was a temporary measure to save his company from a malicious lawsuit, a bureaucratic maneuver to show the bank examiners that his portfolio possessed substantial backing. Seeing the legitimate language at the beginning of the stack lulled me into a false sense of absolute security. I lowered my guard, allowing my fatigue and my paternal devotion to override my analytical training. Wesley hovered closer, his voice low and soothing. "Just initial the bottom of each page, Nathaniel, and sign where the yellow tabs are marked. It is mostly boilerplate language required by the state of Oklahoma for the formation of the LLC." Marlin leaned forward, opening his ink pad and preparing his official notary stamp. I began to sign. I initialed page after page of bureaucratic filler, the rhythm of the scratching pen filling the quiet kitchen. I thought about Priscilla's desperate pleas. I thought about the promise I made to her mother. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was performing a noble, selfless act to rescue my child from financial ruin. I was completely, blissfully unaware of the lethal document slipped expertly into the exact middle of the stack. Buried between pages of meaningless corporate bylaws and tax indemnification clauses was a single devastating sheet of paper. It was a quitclaim deed. By signing that specific page, I was not transferring management rights. I was legally surrendering all ownership, all equity, and all rights to my 5-acre sanctuary directly to Wesley's holding company. I was giving away the home I built with my own 2 hands, transferring a multi-million-dollar property to a predator without receiving a single penny in return. But I did not read that page. My eyes were tired, my heart was heavy, and I simply trusted my family. I signed my name exactly where the bright yellow sticky tab instructed me to, locking the trap shut around my own ankle. The moment my pen lifted from the final signature line, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The thick, suffocating tension that had surrounded Wesley completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling euphoria. He let out a long, heavy breath, practically snatching the stack of papers from the table before the ink was even fully dry. Marlon immediately began stamping the documents with frantic speed, his hands moving efficiently to seal the betrayal. Wesley reached out and grabbed my shoulder, squeezing it with an intensity that felt less like gratitude and more like violent triumph. "Nathaniel, you have saved us," he proclaimed, his voice ringing a little too loudly in the quiet house. "You have no idea what you have just done for our future. I will take these straight to the bank right now. We are going to be completely fine." He did not sit down to discuss his supposed legal battle. He packed the documents with incredible haste and rushed out the front door, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen. Later that afternoon, Priscilla called me. The hysterical, trembling woman from the night before was entirely gone. Her voice was bright and remarkably untroubled. She thanked me, mentioning the bank pre-approved their loan, and everything was back to normal. She sounded so completely fine that a tiny, cold seed of doubt planted itself in the back of my mind. It was a fleeting thought, a whisper from my analytical brain, warning me that human emotions do not recover from total devastation that quickly. But I brushed it aside, choosing to believe in the illusion of her happiness. I poured another cup of coffee and looked out the window at my sprawling green lawn, convinced that my home was safe and my family was secure. I had no idea that the ticking clock of my own destruction had just been activated. I wanted to rest, unaware that my sanctuary had just been legally stolen from under my feet. My absolute certainty of their betrayal did not arrive in a single dramatic flash of lightning. It crept onto my property, exactly 2 weeks before Deputy Halloran ever set foot on my porch, arriving in the form of a mundane, bureaucratic intrusion on a perfectly clear Tuesday afternoon. The Oklahoma sun was warm, beating down on the back of my neck as I knelt in the soft soil of my front garden. I was carefully pruning the antique rose bushes that my late wife had planted the very first spring we moved into this house. Gardening had become my quiet meditation since she passed away, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind anchored to the physical world. I was dusting the dirt from my heavy canvas work gloves when a flash of neon yellow caught the corner of my eye. I stood up slowly, my joints aching with a familiar stiffness, and squinted against the bright afternoon glare. About 50 yards away, near the heavy iron gates that marked the western boundary of my 5-acre estate, stood a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a bright, high-visibility construction vest over a plaid shirt, a white hard hat, and heavy work boots. Beside him, planted firmly into the grass, was a bright yellow tripod holding a sophisticated digital theodolite. He was peering through the optical lens, making careful sweeping adjustments to the leveling knobs, and occasionally jotting down notes on a digital tablet strapped to his forearm. My initial thought was that he was a county surveyor. Occasionally, the city dispatched utility workers to check the public water lines or verify the municipal boundaries along the main road. I assumed he had simply wandered a few yards too far past the public easement and onto my private grass. I wiped the sweat from my brow, grabbed my wooden walking stick from the porch, and made my way across the sprawling lawn to offer him a polite correction. As I approached, The crunch of my boots on the dry grass alerted him to my presence. He stepped back from the theodolite, shielding his eyes from the sun, and offered a polite, professional nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he called out pleasantly. "Beautiful piece of land you have out here." I nodded in return, stopping about 10 feet away from his equipment. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone entirely cordial. "I take a lot of pride in maintaining it. But I do need to ask what exactly brings you onto this side of the gate." The county lines end about 30 feet back toward the pavement, and this is strictly private residential property. The surveyor offered a confused, slightly apologetic smile. He tapped the screen of his rugged tablet, scrolling through a document I could not clearly see. "I apologize if I am intruding, sir," he said, his brow furrowing as he read his screen. "But I am not actually with the county. I am a private commercial contractor, hired by Meridian Federal Bank. I was dispatched to conduct a full topographic survey and a commercial appraisal of this specific parcel." My heart executed a slow, heavy drop in my chest, but my posture remained completely rigid. An engineer does not react to an anomaly by shouting. He gathers more data. "A commercial appraisal?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though a cold chill was beginning to radiate outward from my spine. "That does not make any sense at all. This is a private, single-family residential home. It has been for 30 years. There is absolutely no commercial business operating on this land, and there never will be." The surveyor looked from his tablet to my face, his expression shifting from mild confusion to profound discomfort. He clearly thought he was dealing with an eccentric, uninformed neighbor, or perhaps an elderly tenant who was out of the loop. "Sir, I am just an independent contractor, executing a work order," he explained gently, almost as if speaking to a child. "But according to the bank files right here, this entire 5-acre plot is actively being evaluated for a massive commercial redevelopment project." I tightened my grip on my walking stick, feeling the polished wood press hard against my palm. "A redevelopment project," I echoed, my voice dropping an octave, devoid of any warmth. "Ordered by whom exactly?" The man swiped his finger across the glass screen, pulling up the executive summary of his work order. He read the name aloud, and the syllables hit me like physical strikes to the jaw. "The primary applicant is listed as Thorn Holdings, LLC," he stated clearly. "The bank requires this topographical data to finalize a multi-million-dollar commercial construction loan. According to the approved blueprints attached to this file, Thorn Holdings is scheduling a complete demolition of all existing residential structures on this plot. They are tearing this house down to break ground on a luxury commercial strip mall next month." The afternoon breeze suddenly felt like ice against my skin. The world around me seemed to lose all its ambient sound. The chirping of the mockingbirds, the distant hum of highway traffic, the rustling of the great oak leaves. Everything faded into a muted, ringing silence. My mind, trained for decades to process complex, catastrophic failures, instantly began compiling this devastating new data. Thorn Holdings, LLC. Wesley's company. The same company that was supposedly using my property's management rights merely as a passive shield to avoid future estate taxes. The same company that Priscilla swore was only holding the paper to secure a modest survival loan to save them from bankruptcy. They had not asked for management rights to protect my legacy. They had systematically manipulated me into surrendering my home so they could bulldoze it into the dirt and pave it over for a massive commercial payout. The surveyor shifted uncomfortably, clearly unnerved by the prolonged heavy silence. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "Do you need me to call someone for you? Are you a tenant here?" His questions snapped me back to the present reality. I looked at the digital theodolite, its lens pointing directly at the front door of the home where I had raised my daughter, the home where my wife had drawn her last breath. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent storm of rage and heartbreak deep down into the very bottom of my stomach. I locked it away behind a vault of iron self-control. "I am perfectly fine," I said, my voice eerily calm and meticulously measured. "I am not a tenant. I am the man who built that house. I appreciate you clarifying your presence here today. You are just doing your job, and I will not interfere with your measurements. Please finish your work and have a safe afternoon." I turned my back on the surveyor and began the long walk back toward my front porch. Every step I took across the manicured grass felt different than it had just 10 minutes prior. The ground beneath my boots no longer felt like my sanctuary. It felt like a battlefield. I stepped onto the wooden planks of my front porch, my boots feeling heavier than they had just minutes ago. I did not sit down in my usual rocking chair. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked straight into my study. The air inside the house felt different now, tainted by the invisible threat looming right outside my windows. I calmly picked up my smartphone from the mahogany desk. My thumb hovered over Priscilla's contact name. A part of me, the part that was still just a grieving father, desperately wanted to believe there had been a massive administrative error, but the other part, the analytical mind that had spent decades calculating pressure thresholds and stress fractures, knew better. I pressed the call button and pressed the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before she finally picked up. When the line connected, I was immediately struck by the loud, chaotic background noise. It was not the sound of a bustling corporate office or a distressed startup headquarters fighting off bankruptcy. I heard the unmistakable clinking of crystal glasses, the bright, relaxed laughter of a wealthy crowd, and the smooth, muffled hum of a jazz instrumental playing over a high-end sound system. "Priscilla," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "We need to talk. There is a man with a digital theodolite standing on the western edge of my lawn. He told me he is conducting a commercial topographic survey for Thorn Holdings." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I heard her cover the microphone for a fraction of a second, likely whispering something to Wesley. When she spoke again, her tone was dripping with that condescending, overly patient sweetness that people reserve for young children or the senile. "Dad," she sighed, a soft, breathy sound that vibrated with manufactured exhaustion. "You are getting confused again. I told you about this. Remember? That is just a routine tax appraisal. It is part of the process for the family management company we set up to protect your estate. You do not need to worry your old head about it. Just let the man do his job and go back to your gardening. Everything is perfectly fine." In the background, a distinct, cheerful voice announced something over a public address system. The words were slightly muffled, but I clearly caught the phrase, "fresh powder on the summit." They were at a ski resort. They were in Whitcomb Ridge. "Priscilla," I continued, deliberately ignoring her patronizing tone. "Tax appraisers from the county do not use commercial redevelopment blueprints. This man specifically stated that Thorn Holdings is planning a demolition for a luxury strip mall." Her voice instantly tightened, losing a fraction of its sugary coating. "Dad, honestly, you are overthinking this. The bank just uses generic commercial forms for large acreage plots. It is purely bureaucratic paperwork. Wesley is handling all the complex financial structuring, so you do not have to stress about it. We are in the middle of a very important meeting with some potential investors right now. I really have to go. Go make yourself some tea, okay? I love you." The line went dead. A hollow, rhythmic dialing tone echoed in the silent study. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the surface of my desk. I did not throw it. I did not curse or strike the wall. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity washed over my entire being. For 35 years, I worked as a petroleum chief engineer. My entire professional existence was dedicated to identifying anomalies. When you are managing a deep-water drilling rig, A single microscopic hairline fracture in a pressure valve can lead to a catastrophic explosion that costs billions of dollars and hundreds of human lives. You are trained to never ignore the data, no matter how much you wish the readings were wrong. You look at the math, you analyze the structural integrity, and you trust the evidence over the narrative. Standing in my quiet study, I applied that exact same rigorous methodology to my own daughter and son-in-law. I began to run the numbers in my head. Data point number 1. 4 months ago, Wesley sat at my kitchen table and swore his technology company was being suffocated by a malicious lawsuit. He claimed his assets were frozen and bankruptcy was imminent. Data point number 2. Just 2 weeks ago, Wesley pulled into my driveway to deliver my groceries, driving a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. When I casually asked him about it, he quickly claimed it was merely a temporary corporate lease, a necessary expense to maintain appearances for his clients. Data point number 3. Priscilla had just answered my phone call from a luxury ski resort in Whitcomb Ridge, Montana, claiming to be in a meeting with investors while sipping cocktails in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The structural integrity of their story was completely collapsing under its own weight. Bankrupt people do not purchase six-figure luxury vehicles. People facing total financial ruin do not take lavish midweek vacations to exclusive ski resorts. The math did not add up. The pressure readings were entirely off. They were not drowning in debt. They were flush with cash. My mind raced back to the night they begged me for help. I had offered them my liquid savings. I had offered to write a personal check to save them from eviction. Wesley had adamantly refused. He did not want cash. He specifically needed the deed to my property. He needed the physical land. He needed the asset. The surveyor had not made a mistake. The blueprints he held were absolutely real. Wesley and Priscilla had deliberately manipulated my grief. They had used my profound love for my late wife and the promise I made to protect our daughter as a psychological crowbar to pry the deed to my home out of my hands. They had engineered a perfectly legal facade to steal a multi-million-dollar estate, fully intending to bulldoze the only physical connection I had left to my past. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out at the front lawn. The surveyor was packing up his bright yellow tripod, finishing his task for the day. He was securing the final data points required to seal my fate. The sorrow that had gripped my heart for the past 4 months began to harden, crystallizing into a dense, impenetrable layer of cold resolve. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to keep his family together. I was an engineer, investigating a critical system failure. My daughter and her husband thought they had successfully bypassed all my defense mechanisms. They assumed my old age made me blind, deaf, and compliant. But an engineer never relies on assumptions. An engineer demands physical proof. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to see the blueprint of their betrayal with my own eyes. I needed the raw data. I needed to go to their empty house today. The truth was waiting in the shadows, and I was fully prepared to drag it into the light. I walked to my heavy pickup truck, my mind locked into a singular, undeniable objective. The drive from my rural property to Wesley and Priscilla's upscale rented townhouse took nearly 40 minutes. The closer I got to the affluent suburb, the more the anger solidified in my chest. I had brought along a stack of misdelivered mail that had arrived at my address a few days prior. A perfectly reasonable excuse for an unexpected fatherly visit. If they happened to be home, I would simply hand over the envelopes, smile warmly, and leave. But my instincts, honed by years of predicting the unpredictable, told me the house would be empty. Priscilla had claimed to be in a meeting with investors, while background noise placed her firmly at a luxury ski resort. Wesley was likely with her, celebrating their impending wealth. I pulled into their immaculate tree-lined street and parked my truck 2 houses down. The neighborhood was painfully quiet, filled with manicured hedges and expensive vehicles. I grabbed the mail from the passenger seat, walked up their pristine concrete driveway, and pressed the glowing doorbell camera. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. I rang it a second time. The house remained completely silent. No footsteps, no shifting shadows behind the frosted glass door. They were definitely gone. I turned away from the door, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thud. I was about to cross a significant boundary, but they had already crossed the ultimate line by stealing my entire future. I stepped off the front porch and casually walked down the side path leading to their backyard alley. I moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had every right to be there. Hidden behind a tall wooden privacy fence were 3 large municipal garbage bins. It was collection day tomorrow, and the bins were overflowing. In the corporate engineering world, when you suspect catastrophic malfeasance, you do not just ask the guilty party for a voluntary confession. You look for the discarded data. You audit the waste. I lifted the heavy plastic lid of the black recycling bin. Beneath a layer of empty imported wine bottles and expensive takeout containers, I spotted exactly what I was hoping to find. There were 2 tightly tied grocery bags filled with paper waste. I did not hesitate. I reached in, grabbed the bags by their plastic handles, and carried them quickly back to my truck. I tossed them onto the floorboard of the passenger side, climbed behind the steering wheel, and drove away without looking back. My hands gripped the leather wheel tightly as I navigated the winding suburban roads. I felt a strange sense of clarity washing over me. The confusion and the lingering grief that had clouded my judgment for the past 4 months were completely gone. I was operating purely on logic and an intense burning desire for absolute justice. I needed to see the physical blueprint of their betrayal with my own 2 eyes. When I returned to my own home, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line. I carried the plastic bags inside and securely locked the front door behind me. I went into the living room, pushed the heavy coffee table out of the way, and spread a large canvas drop cloth across the hardwood floor. I dumped the contents of the first bag. It was mostly junk mail, glossy magazines, and empty envelopes. But the second bag was entirely different. It contained a massive mound of cross-cut paper shreds. Wesley had evidently purchased a heavy-duty shredder, but he had severely underestimated the patience of an engineer. He thought destroying the physical documents would permanently erase the trail of his deception. He did not realize that piecing together shattered fragments was what I had spent my entire career doing. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by thousands of tiny paper ribbons. I grabbed a roll of clear adhesive tape, a pair of sharp tweezers, and a bright desk lamp. I began the agonizingly slow process of sorting the shreds. I separated the pieces with blue ink from those with black. I isolated the tiny fragments with red corporate letterhead. Hour after hour passed in absolute silence. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving the quiet house, bathed in the harsh, artificial light of my lamp. My back ached, and my eyes burned relentlessly, but I absolutely refused to stop. By midnight, a distinct and terrifying picture had begun to form on the canvas cloth. The first document I managed to assemble was an internal email chain between Wesley and a major commercial real estate developer. The subject line was, "Project Sanctuary Acquisition." Reading those terrible words made my blood run completely cold. They had jokingly named the demolition project after the very word I used to describe my beloved home. The emails discussed the specific timeline for transferring the deed from the fake family management company into a newly created corporate holding account, entirely controlled by Wesley. But the most damning evidence was pieced together near the center of the drop cloth. It was a massive, multi-page financial prospectus, heavily detailed and legally binding. I carefully taped the final corner of the summary page into place and read the bold black text. The document clearly outlined a commercial development plan, budgeted at exactly $3.5 million. It listed my exact residential address, my precise property lines, and my geographic coordinates. The proposal was to completely level the existing residential structures, clear the ancient oak trees, and pave a massive concrete parking lot. The primary anchor tenant listed on the second page was a high-end corporate retail chain. My home, my sanctuary, was not being managed to protect my estate from taxes. It was scheduled for total irreversible demolition in exactly less than 30 days. I sat back on my heels, staring at the taped-together documents until the black letters blurred together. The sheer calculated cruelty of their plan was absolutely staggering. They had not acted out of desperation or financial panic. This was not a last-minute attempt to save a failing technology startup. This was a premeditated, highly orchestrated corporate heist. The emails I pieced together dated back over 8 months. They had been planning this long before that rainy Tuesday night when they showed up on my porch crying. Priscilla's desperate tears, Wesley's frantic pacing, the deliberate invoking of my dead wife's memory. It was all a rehearsed theatrical performance designed to exploit my deepest emotional vulnerabilities. They knew I would never sell the precious land willingly. They knew I wanted to preserve the beautiful house where we had shared so much joy. So they bypassed my logic and attacked my heart. They created a fake crisis, brought in a fake notary, and slipped a real quitclaim deed into a stack of fake management papers. They stole my property right in front of my face, smiling at me, while they successfully executed their flawless trap. Now I finally understood the complete and absolute, ultimate, horrifying truth of their completely unforgivable and utterly ruthless financial betrayal. I sat alone on the floor of my study, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered reality. The initial wave of nauseating shock had finally crested, leaving behind a cold, sterile void. I stared at the reconstructed blueprint, tracing the black lines that represented the absolute destruction of my life's work. The sheer depth of their greed was difficult to comprehend. They were not satisfied with securing a loan. They wanted every single blade of grass, every brick, and every memory crushed into dust for a commercial payout. But as the emotional fog cleared, an analytical question began to surface. The puzzle pieces fit perfectly, displaying their objective, but they did not explain the precise mechanical execution of the crime. How had they legally bound me to my own ruin? I closed my eyes and transported myself back to that morning in my kitchen. I replayed the entire interaction, analyzing every single variable, spoken word, and gesture. I visualized the stack of legal documents resting on my dining table. I remembered Wesley hovering over my shoulder, his voice calm as he pointed to the bright yellow sticky tabs. I remembered Marlon, the sweaty notary, clutching his stamp like a weapon. The architecture of their deception slowly revealed itself. The top pages of that massive stack were entirely legitimate. They detailed the formation of Thorne Family Holdings, filled with the standard boilerplate language we had discussed. I had read those initial pages, confirming they aligned with the narrative of a temporary management transfer to avoid estate taxes. By the time I reached the middle of the stack, my eyes were tired, and my heart was heavy with grief for my daughter's fabricated tears. I had stopped reading the fine print. I had simply trusted them. I moved my pen from one yellow tab to the next, initialing and signing wherever Wesley instructed. That was the exact moment they executed the bait and switch. Buried deep within the mind-numbing corporate bylaws and tax indemnification clauses was the lethal quitclaim deed. It was a document designed to completely sever my ownership and instantly transfer the total legal title of my 5-acre estate directly into Wesley's corporate holding account. By signing that specific page, I had voluntarily handed over a multi-million-dollar property without receiving a single penny in compensation. Marlon was there to provide the official state sanction, stamping his notary seal to ensure the fraudulent transfer was ironclad and legally binding. They had weaponized my love, my fatigue, and my trust to bypass my logical defenses. My hands curled into tight fists, the fingernails biting sharply into my palms. A dark, primal urge flared deep inside my chest. My first instinct was to stand up, grab my truck keys, and drive straight back to their upscale townhouse. I wanted to kick their front door off its hinges. I wanted to throw the taped blueprint onto their expensive glass coffee table and demand to know how my own daughter could do this to me. I wanted to scream until my lungs burned, to confront them with the undeniable physical proof of their sickening betrayal. I wanted to watch the smug, arrogant smiles melt right off their faces as they realized their brilliant, foolproof plan had been entirely exposed. But my training as an engineer instantly slammed the brakes on that emotional impulse. When you discover a critical failure in a highly volatile system, you do not immediately start hitting the pipes with a hammer. A sudden, uncontrolled reaction can cause the entire structure to violently explode. If I confronted Wesley and Priscilla now, I would completely surrender my only tactical advantage. I would be tipping my hand. Wesley was a cunning, slippery corporate manipulator. If he realized I had discovered the fraudulent quitclaim deed, he would not simply apologize. He would instantly go on the defensive. He would shred any remaining digital evidence, transfer the commercial loan funds to offshore accounts, and immediately hire an army of ruthless defense attorneys. They would spin a narrative, painting me as a confused, senile old man who willingly signed away his property. They would bury me in prolonged litigation until I ran out of money and was forced out of my home anyway. I took a slow, deep breath, consciously regulating my heart rate. The loving, trusting father, who had desperately wanted to protect his little girl, died right there on the study floor. That man was gone, buried beneath the shredded evidence of his daughter's profound greed. What rose from the canvas dropcloth was a completely different entity. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a cold, calculating hunter, and I was staring directly at my prey. I carefully gathered the taped documents, folding the damning commercial blueprint with meticulous precision. I walked over to the heavy steel safe hidden behind a bookshelf in my study, spun the combination dial, and locked the evidence securely inside. I gathered the remaining paper shreds, placed them in a heavy-duty garbage bag, and tied it shut. I completely erased every single trace of my investigation. I had to maintain the illusion of compliance. I had to continue playing the role of the oblivious, helpful father who believed his family was finally safe and secure. I walked into the kitchen and poured the cold remnants of my morning coffee down the stainless steel sink. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. The man looking back at me was tired, but his eyes were sharp and entirely focused. If Wesley wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft, I needed to upgrade my arsenal. I could not fight a complex legal battle using only my engineering background and a taped-together piece of garbage. I needed someone who completely understood the dark mechanics of commercial real estate fraud. I needed a professional who could systematically dismantle Wesley's holding company, freeze his assets, and expose his forgery to the federal authorities without giving him a second to react. I did not need a standard family lawyer. I needed a legal shark, a ruthless, bloodthirsty litigator who specialized in tearing corrupt executives to pieces. My mind drifted back to a massive corporate dispute I had witnessed a decade ago. A rival oil conglomerate had attempted a hostile takeover of a drilling project using falsified environmental reports. Our company had brought in an external legal consultant to handle the litigation. He was a brilliant, terrifyingly efficient man who completely destroyed the opposing counsel in a matter of weeks. leaving their executives facing criminal charges. His name was Emmett Cade, and he was universally feared in the corporate sector for his uncompromising aggressive tactics. Emmett did not negotiate settlements. He annihilated his opponents and salted the earth behind them. I walked back to my study and opened my leather contact book. I flipped through the pages until I found his exact direct private number. I picked up my smartphone, my hand entirely steady, and dialed the digits. I listened to the ringing tone, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across my lawn. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. It was not Emmett, but his senior partner, who informed me that Emmett had retired. However, he immediately provided me with the direct contact information for the only man Emmett trusted to handle complex asset recovery. The man's name was Frank Delgado, a veteran trust and real estate litigator based in downtown Cardell. I briefly explained my situation to his answering service, leaving my secure contact details. With the legal foundation quietly laid, I knew I had to buy myself time to build an airtight case. Wesley and Priscilla were moving rapidly, fueled by the promise of a massive commercial payout. If they suspected for a single second that I was investigating their fraudulent quitclaim deed, they would accelerate the demolition schedule. I needed them completely relaxed, entirely confident in their victory, and absolutely dismissive of me as a legitimate threat. To achieve this, I decided to play the exact character they had already cast me as in their twisted narrative. I would become the clueless, deteriorating old man they believed they had so easily swindled. The very next morning, I began the meticulous performance of my own cognitive decline. I started with subtle, calculated errors. When Priscilla came over to check on me, under the guise of bringing me lunch, I intentionally called her by her late mother's name. I saw the flash of triumph cross her eyes, quickly masked by a look of feigned, condescending sympathy. I stumbled over my words during our conversation, repeating the same mundane questions about her husband's fictional legal troubles. Over the next few days, I escalated the performance with precise, deliberate actions. I left my heavy brass keyring sitting on the middle shelf of the kitchen refrigerator, right next to a carton of milk, ensuring Wesley would be the one to find it when he came to grab a beer. I watched from the hallway as he pulled the cold keys from the fridge, shaking his head and muttering a cruel joke under his breath. I began intentionally missing our scheduled phone calls, claiming later that I had completely forgotten how to operate my smartphone. I even started complaining about a sudden concerning deterioration in my heart condition. I would sit in my armchair, clutching my chest, breathing shallowly, and whispering about phantom pains radiating down my left arm. Priscilla played her part to perfection, hovering over me with fake concern, while simultaneously shooting knowing victorious glances at Wesley. They completely bought the act. In their greedy minds, my rapid decline was the absolute perfect scenario. A senile, physically failing father would never possess the mental acuity to challenge a complex corporate real estate transfer. They believed I was simply fading away, a convenient ghost haunting the property they were about to bulldoze. Their guard, previously maintained with cautious, manipulative phone calls and rehearsed visits, dropped entirely. They stopped asking probing questions about my daily schedule. They stopped monitoring my movements. They simply left me alone to wither, assuming the battle was already won. This fabricated isolation provided me with the exact operational window I desperately required. On a crisp Thursday morning, while Wesley and Priscilla were supposedly attending another crucial meeting with their phantom investors, I initiated my counteroffensive. I dressed in a simple, unremarkable gray suit, ensuring I looked like any other elderly gentleman heading to a routine doctor's appointment. I left my primary smartphone resting on the kitchen counter, knowing Wesley had likely installed a location tracking application under the guise of monitoring my deteriorating health. I took a prepaid, untraceable cellular phone I had purchased with cash days earlier and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I climbed into my heavy pickup truck and pulled out of my gravel driveway, my heart beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. I did not drive directly to the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Cardell. Instead, I took a winding route through rural back roads, constantly checking my rear-view mirror. I eventually merged onto the highway, blending seamlessly into traffic. Approaching the city center, I deliberately avoided the expensive parking garages near the legal district. I parked 3 blocks away in a dimly lit municipal structure. I paid the fee in cash, pulled my collar up, and began the walk toward the financial heart. The streets of Cardell were crowded with young professionals, none of them paying attention to the old man walking quietly among them. I moved with purposeful strides, my mind focused entirely on the impending legal battle. I finally arrived at a sleek, imposing building, composed entirely of dark glass and polished steel. I bypassed the main reception desk and took a private elevator directly to the 42nd floor. The brass plaque beside the heavy oak doors read simply, "Frank Delgado, Corporate Litigation and Trust Recovery." I pushed the doors open and walked into a waiting room that exuded quiet, ruthless power. The walls were lined with stark modern art, and the receptionist sat behind a massive slab of black marble. I gave her my name, and within seconds, I was escorted down a long, silent hallway into a corner office that overlooked the sprawling Oklahoma Capitol. Standing behind an expansive, clutter-free desk was Frank Delgado. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with sharp, predatory eyes and a jawline carved from granite. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit him like a layer of armor. He simply extended a firm hand and gestured toward a leather chair opposite his desk. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone that demanded instant respect. "Emmett's former partner gave me a brief overview of your situation. He mentioned a fraudulent quitclaim deed and a multi-million-dollar commercial demolition project orchestrated by your own family." I took a seat, feeling the immense weight of the past 2 weeks finally begin to shift from my shoulders onto his capable desk. "That is correct, Mr. Delgado," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of the senile tremor I had perfected for my daughter. "They executed a highly sophisticated bait-and-switch using a fake family management company to steal my 5-acre estate. They planned to level my home in less than 30 days to build a luxury retail center." Frank Delgado leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. His dark eyes analyzed me with cold, calculating precision. "Most men your age would be entirely broken by this betrayal," he observed quietly. "You do not look broken. You look like a man who is preparing to go to war." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick envelope containing the coordinates, the corporate registration numbers, and the pieced-together blueprints I had extracted from Wesley's garbage. I placed the envelope squarely in the center of his desk. "I am not broken," I stated clearly, matching his intense gaze. "I am an engineer, and I have discovered a catastrophic structural failure. I am here to hire you to dismantle their operation, freeze their assets, and salt the earth beneath them. I want them completely and utterly ruined forever." Frank Delgado did not flinch at my declaration. A slow, razor-thin smile spread across his face, the kind of smile a predator wears right before it strikes. He reached across his immaculate desk and picked up the thick envelope I had brought. He did not ask me if I was sure. He did not counsel me on the virtues of family forgiveness or suggest a quiet, out-of-court mediation. He simply pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his paralegal team. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that leather chair while Frank transformed his corner office into a war room. He mobilized forensic accountants, contacted title search agencies, and bypassed bureaucratic red tape with a terrifying practiced efficiency. He treated my pieced-together blueprints not as garbage, but as a roadmap to a crime scene. I watched him work, sipping a glass of iced water, feeling the remaining traces of my paternal grief evaporate, replaced entirely by the cold structural logic of impending justice. By late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows across the Cardell skyline, Frank walked back into the room, holding a stiff manila folder. He sat down heavily in his chair, his expression shifting into something remarkably grim. He opened the folder and slid a certified county-stamped document across the polished wood toward me. I knew exactly what it was before I even read the bold print at the top of the page. It was the quitclaim deed. Frank pointed a silver pen at the bottom right corner of the paper, tapping the glass surface of the desk for emphasis. They filed this with the county clerk exactly 1 day after they sat at your kitchen table, he explained, his voice devoid of any emotion. You were entirely correct about their methodology, Mr. Reyes. They buried this complete transfer of ownership right in the middle of standard limited liability formation papers. You signed away your entire estate under the fabricated pretense of establishing a tax management vehicle. I stared at my own signature. The ink was dark and steady. Beside it was the official brightly colored stamp of Marlin, the sweaty, nervous notary who had facilitated the theft. Seeing the physical document, the actual instrument of my ruin, made the betrayal feel incredibly visceral. It was one thing to deduce their methodology from shredded trash, but holding the state-certified proof of their deception was entirely different. I traced the line of my signature with my index finger. I told him that I had initialed 50 pages that morning, believing I was protecting my daughter's future. Frank nodded slowly, pulling another document from the folder. The notary was fully complicit, he stated firmly. He deliberately bypassed the standard verbal confirmation protocol. By state law, he was strictly required to ask you out loud if you understood you were signing a quitclaim deed, surrendering your property. He intentionally skipped that mandated step to ensure you remained completely blind to the transaction. It is a textbook case of fraudulent execution, but the theft of the physical property was only the primary stage of their operation. Frank leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and genuine warning. The commercial redevelopment blueprints you recovered from their trash are entirely real, but they are a long-term projection. Wesley is an impatient man. He did not want to wait for construction permits to clear before cashing in on his theft. He executed a secondary maneuver immediately after securing the deed. Frank slid a final stack of papers across the desk. These were not county records. They were heavily redacted federal banking files. I looked at the top sheet, scanning the complex financial data. Wesley took your stolen certified quitclaim deed directly to Meridian Federal Bank, Frank explained, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. He used the total unencumbered equity of your 5-acre estate as premier collateral to secure an immediate massive cash loan. My eyes locked onto the bolded numbers printed near the bottom of the banking contract. The figure was staggering. Wesley had successfully secured a $2.5 million commercial cash loan against my property. The money had been wired directly into an offshore corporate holding account, controlled exclusively by Thorn Holdings. That explained the brand new Porsche. That explained the luxury ski vacation in Whitcomb Ridge on a random Tuesday afternoon. They were not fighting off a malicious lawsuit. They were living like absolute royalty on stolen federal funds. Wesley did not just steal your land, Frank continued, his eyes locking onto mine. By presenting a fraudulently obtained deed to a federally insured banking institution to secure commercial funding, your son-in-law has crossed a massive legal threshold. He has committed textbook, undeniable federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud. This is no longer just a civil dispute over a family property transfer. This is a severe federal crime, carrying decades of mandatory prison time. The silence in the office was profound. I absorbed the magnitude of the data. My daughter and her husband had mortgaged my past to fund their immediate insatiable greed, and in doing so, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. If I simply sued them in civil court to reverse the deed, Wesley would drag the process out for years, using the very funds he stole from me. But federal bank fraud was entirely different. The federal government does not negotiate with thieves who defraud their banking institutions. They freeze assets instantly. They deploy tactical agents. They crush the offenders with the full, merciless weight of the law. I looked at Frank, feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my mind. My senile old man act had worked perfectly. They believed I was decaying in my recliner, utterly oblivious to the fact that I was actively arming a financial warhead directly beneath their feet. "Well, what is our precise tactical approach, Mr. Delgado?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. I do not want to merely scare them. I want the trap to snap shut so fast they do not even have time to blink. Frank smiled again, gathering the documents and tapping them neatly against his desk. "We build an impenetrable fortress of evidence," he replied smoothly. "We trace every single cent of that $2.5 million wire transfer. We document their luxury purchases to prove the funds were not used for legitimate corporate survival. We compile a dossier so absolutely devastating that the federal prosecutors will have no choice but to act immediately. And while we do that, you go back home. You continue to play the failing, confused father. You let them measure your lawn. You let them plan their shopping mall. You let them believe they are the smartest people in Oklahoma. We will quietly let them continue to dig their own deep graves, right up until the precise moment we formally decide to finally bury them both permanently, beneath the absolute crushing, inescapable weight of their own monumental greed and staggering, completely unforgivable, calculated betrayal." Frank Delgado stared down at the banking documents spread across his immaculate mahogany desk, his jaw set so tightly that a muscle pulsed visibly in his cheek. As a veteran attorney who had spent decades dismantling complex financial fraud, he was not easily shocked. Yet the sheer brazen audacity of Wesley's maneuver had ignited a profound professional fury within him. He had just laid out the timeline of a perfectly executed, multi-million-dollar heist, but his legal mind could not tolerate the thought of the stolen capital vanishing into the ether. He abruptly pushed his heavy leather chair back, the wheels gliding silently over the thick carpet, and reached for the secure landline phone resting on the corner of his desk. "Mr. Reyes," Frank said, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative register that brooked no argument. "I appreciate the tactical patience of waiting, but we cannot allow $2.5 million of illicitly obtained federal funds to fully settle into a Caribbean tax haven. Once that money disperses through offshore shell accounts, recovering it becomes an international jurisdictional nightmare. I have direct high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in their white-collar crimes division. We need to call them right this second, secure an emergency federal injunction, and freeze Thorn Holdings before your son-in-law moves another single cent." Frank lifted the heavy receiver, his finger hovering over the keypad, fully prepared to initiate the overwhelming power of the federal government. But before he could press the first digit, I reached across the wide expanse of the desk and firmly placed my hand directly over his. I did not speak immediately. I simply looked at him, feeling a slow, remarkably cold and chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an engineer who had just watched an arrogant saboteur step directly onto a hidden landmine. Frank paused, his eyes narrowing as he read the absolute, unshakable confidence radiating from my posture. He slowly lowered the telephone receiver back into its cradle, leaning forward with an expression of intense, guarded curiosity. "Frank," I said, my voice smooth and meticulously measured, completely devoid of the panic or desperation that typically accompanies such massive financial losses. "I do not want you to call the federal authorities just yet. I do not want to freeze his offshore accounts, and I certainly do not want to interrupt his euphoric celebration. In fact, I want Wesley to feel entirely invincible. I want him to believe he has successfully executed the most brilliant financial crime in the history of Oklahoma real estate." Frank frowned, folding his hands together on the desk. "With all due respect, Nathaniel, allowing a criminal to actively launder millions of dollars based on a forged quitclaim deed is an incredibly dangerous game. If we do not act immediately, he will drain the equity from your estate and leave you holding an empty foreclosed bag." I shook my head slowly, keeping my chilling smile perfectly intact. "That is precisely where you are mistaken, my friend," I replied softly. "Wesley cannot drain the equity from my estate because Wesley does not own my estate. And more importantly, neither do I." I watched as the veteran litigation lawyer processed my statement, his sharp eyes searching my face for any sign of confusion or senility. When he found none, I continued my explanation, laying out the structural mechanics of my hidden defense. "I want you to go back into your county property records, Frank. I want you to look past the fraudulent quitclaim deed that Wesley filed 2 weeks ago. I want you to look all the way back to October of 2018. Frank immediately turned to his multiple computer monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. He accessed the secure county clerk database, his eyes scanning the digital archives. As he scrolled through the historical filings associated with my residential address, I provided the necessary context. In 2018, shortly after my late wife received her initial terrifying medical diagnosis, we sat down and had a very long, very difficult conversation about the future, I explained, my voice steady, though the memory still carried a phantom weight. We knew her condition was terminal. We also knew that our daughter Priscilla had always possessed a weakness for shiny things and expensive lifestyles. We loved her deeply, but we were not blind to her flaws. My wife was terrified that after she passed away, Priscilla might eventually convince me to sell our beautiful sanctuary to fund some fleeting luxurious whim. To honor my wife and to protect the land we had nurtured together, I made a definitive, unbreakable legal maneuver. Frank suddenly stopped typing. He leaned closer to his primary monitor, reading a deeply buried, highly complex legal filing. His eyes widened slightly, a rare display of genuine astonishment crossing his seasoned features. I hired a specialized estate firm in Halloway, a group completely disconnected from anyone in Cardell, I continued, detailing the architecture of my hidden fortress. I took the entire 5-acre estate, the house, the gardens, every single blade of grass, and I transferred the total absolute ownership into a highly restrictive, irrevocable blind trust. I named a neutral third-party corporate fiduciary as the sole trustee. I am simply the designated occupant and the passive beneficiary. I have the legal right to live in that house until the day I die, but I do not possess the legal authority to sell it, leverage it, mortgage it, or transfer it. Frank slowly turned his gaze away from the computer screen and looked directly at me. The dawning comprehension on his face was a magnificent sight to behold. He realized exactly what I had done. He realized the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the trap Wesley had blindly stumbled into. Therefore, I stated, bringing the hammer down on the final inescapable truth, the signature I placed on that fraudulent quitclaim deed in my kitchen is legally worthless. It is a completely void instrument. I cannot give away an asset I do not legally own. The transfer of the deed to Thorn Holdings is a spectacular, beautifully documented legal fiction. A low, rumbling chuckle escaped Delgado's chest, growing into a genuine dark laugh. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He took a void piece of paper, a document with absolutely no legal standing, and he presented it to a federally insured banking institution as primary collateral, Frank murmured, summarizing the fatal error. He defrauded a major commercial bank out of $2.5 million, using a ghost asset. Nathaniel, your son-in-law did not just steal from you. He stole from the federal government. He committed massive textbook wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud on an unprecedented scale. Exactly, I replied, my cold voice devoid of mercy. That is why we must not call the police today. We will let Wesley proceed with his fraudulent eviction. Once he presents that void deed to law enforcement, his criminal intent becomes absolutely undeniable. The FBI will then have an airtight federal case. I left Frank Delgado standing in his corner office, overlooking the Cardell skyline, his legal machinery quietly humming into motion. We had a bulletproof strategy to trap Wesley in a federal wire fraud indictment. But a lingering shadow of doubt remained in my analytical mind regarding my daughter. Wesley was the corporate architect of the loan, but Priscilla was the psychological key that had unlocked my defenses. I needed to know beyond a shadow of a doubt the exact depth of her complicity. Was she merely a passive beneficiary of her husband's ruthless ambition? Or was she an active, willing participant in the destruction of her father? To secure an airtight case against her, I needed raw, unfiltered audio. I needed to hear how she spoke when she thought the microphones were off. I drove to a specialized electronics retailer on the edge of the city and purchased a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder, equipped with real-time cellular transmission and a continuous global positioning tracker. It was smaller than a standard matchbook, encased in matte black plastic, and practically invisible in the shadows. I returned to my quiet estate, the house they believed they had already conquered, and prepared the stage for my performance. I brewed a pot of chamomile tea, letting it steep until it was lukewarm and bitter. I rumpled my clothing, neglected to shave, and adjusted my posture to reflect a man rapidly collapsing under the weight of his own failing mind. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Priscilla. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my voice waver, injecting a note of pathetic, desperate confusion. Priscilla, I wheezed, pausing to cough weakly. I am having a terrible day. I cannot find the property tax files, and my chest feels incredibly tight. Could you please come over and have some tea with your old father? She hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely weighing the inconvenience against the necessity of maintaining her loving daughter facade. Of course, Dad, she replied, her voice dripping with manufactured sugary sweetness. I will be right there. Just sit down and rest. She arrived less than an hour later. Through the front window, I watched her step out of her vehicle, carrying an oversized, impeccably crafted black Prada handbag. It was a brand new limited edition piece that cost more than I used to earn in 2 months of hard labor. It was a tangible leather-bound monument to the federal bank fraud they had just committed. I shuffled slowly to the front door, my hands trembling deliberately as I fumbled with the brass deadbolt. When I finally pulled the door open, she greeted me with a tight, practiced smile. Her eyes scanned my disheveled appearance, and I saw a fleeting, unmistakable glint of supreme satisfaction. She completely believed the illusion. She genuinely thought my cognitive and physical decline was accelerating precisely on her demolition schedule. I led her into the kitchen, my steps painfully slow and unsteady. I poured the tea purposely, allowing my shaking wrist to spill a small puddle of the amber liquid onto the granite countertop. "Oh, look what I have done," I muttered, dropping my head in feigned embarrassment. My hands just do not work the way they used to. I am so sorry, Priscilla. She sighed, a soft sound of profound irritation, and placed her luxurious Prada bag carefully onto the center of the kitchen island, safely away from the spilled tea. "It is fine, Dad," she said, grabbing a paper towel and aggressively wiping the counter. "Just sit down before you hurt yourself." I sank into one of the wooden kitchen chairs, resting my hands on my knees. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I rambled incoherently about the weather, deliberately losing my train of thought mid-sentence. Priscilla checked her diamond-encrusted wristwatch 3 times in less than 5 minutes. She was growing incredibly impatient, anxious to return to her stolen wealth. "Dad, I really need to use the restroom," she announced abruptly, standing up and smoothing the front of her designer blouse. "I will be right back, and then I have to go. Wesley is waiting for me to finalize some dinner reservations." She turned and walked rapidly down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. I remained perfectly still, listening as the heavy wooden door clicked shut. A moment later, I heard the muffled, unmistakable sound of her voice. She had answered a phone call. I moved from my chair, with the silent, fluid grace of a man 30 years younger. I crept down the hallway, pressing my ear against the painted wood of the bathroom door. She was speaking to Wesley. "I am leaving in 5 minutes," she hissed, her voice vibrating with intense disgust. "I cannot stand being in this house much longer. It literally reeks of stale medicine and the smell of old people. He is completely losing his mind, Wesley. He spilled tea all over himself like a toddler. We do not even need to worry about him challenging the eviction. He will probably be in a nursing home before the bulldozers even arrive." Her cruel, callous words were the final nail in the coffin of my paternal mercy. The absolute confirmation of her active malice extinguished any lingering doubt. She was not a victim. She was a predator. I stepped away from the door and moved silently back into the kitchen. I approached the kitchen island and stood over the open Prada handbag. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the matte black micro-recorder. I slipped my fingers deep into the luxurious interior of the designer purse, locating a small zippered cosmetic pocket nestled in the dark silk lining. With surgical precision, I dropped the tiny device into the very bottom of the concealed compartment and zipped it securely shut. It was completely undetectable. I was back in my wooden chair, staring blankly at my cold cup of tea by the time she emerged from the hallway. Priscilla grabbed her purse, offered a final hollow promise to call me tomorrow, and practically sprinted out the front door. I watched her vehicle disappear down the street, carrying my digital spy directly into the heart of their criminal operation. Hours later, the dark Oklahoma night had fully enveloped my isolated rural estate. I sat entirely alone in the deep, undisturbed shadows of my quiet study. The only source of illumination was the steady, glowing green light of the audio receiver, resting squarely on my polished mahogany desk. I slowly poured myself a single measure of expensive aged bourbon. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the familiar warm burn travel down my throat. I leaned back in my worn leather chair, closed my eyes for a brief moment, and gently turned the volume dial upward. The crisp, flawlessly clear audio of Wesley and Priscilla laughing gleefully, celebrating their monumental corporate theft, immediately filled the dark room. Every single vicious word they spoke was permanently recorded, providing me with the exact, undeniable ammunition I needed to guarantee they would both spend the next 2 decades locked inside a federal prison. The memory of that dark study and the glowing green light vanished, replaced entirely by the harsh glare of the morning sun. I stood on the wooden planks of my front porch, the air thick with the humidity of an Oklahoma summer. Standing directly in front of me, clutching a manila folder containing a fraudulent eviction notice, was Deputy Halloran. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one booted foot to the other. He was a young officer instructed to handle what he believed was a routine removal of a confused, senile old man who had simply lost track of his financial obligations. The neighborhood was completely silent, save for the obnoxious rhythmic blaring of a car horn. I looked past the deputy toward the street. Parked illegally across my driveway was Wesley. He sat behind the steering wheel of his custom silver Porsche. The window rolled completely down. He was leaning out, resting his elbow on the expensive leather, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He pressed the heel of his hand against the horn, letting the sharp sound echo through the quiet neighborhood. "Time is up, Boomer," he yelled loudly, his voice carrying over the manicured lawns. "Bring him out, officer. We have a demolition crew waiting on standby, and I am not paying them by the hour to sit around." Wesley laughed, a harsh grating sound that vibrated with the absolute certainty of his manufactured victory. Deputy Halloran sighed deeply, a sound of genuine pity, and took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his tone adopting that overly gentle, patronizing cadence reserved for the elderly. "I am truly sorry, sir, but the court order is legally binding. Thorn Holdings owns this property now. I need you to gather your belongings and vacate the premises immediately. If you need medical transport to a care facility, I can call an ambulance to assist you." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us, preparing to guide me out of the only home I had left. He was merely a pawn, a local law enforcement officer, completely unaware that he had just stepped onto a massive federal crime scene. I did not move. I did not tremble, and I did not fake a sudden pain in my chest. The pathetic, deteriorating old man vanished entirely. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back, and looked the deputy directly in his eyes. The sudden shift in my demeanor caused him to freeze, his hand dropping slowly to his side. The pity in his expression was replaced by a sharp defensive confusion. "Officer Halloran," I said, my voice resonating with a cold authority that had commanded deep-water drilling rigs for over 30 years. "Before you execute that document, and before you make the single biggest, most catastrophic professional mistake of your entire law enforcement career, I want you to hear exactly what my loving daughter said last night." I reached into the front pocket of my trousers and withdrew my smartphone. I did not fumble with the screen. My hands were perfectly steady. I tapped the glass once, accessing the secure audio file I had downloaded directly from the micro recorder, hidden deep inside Priscilla's designer purse. Resting on the thick wooden railing of my porch, disguised among the potted ferns, was a heavy-duty Bluetooth speaker. I had purchased it specifically for this exact moment. It was designed to project sound over the roar of heavy machinery. I engaged the wireless connection. The speaker chimed with a low bass tone, confirming the link. I looked across the street. Wesley had stopped honking his horn, his arrogant smile faltering slightly as he noticed the sudden delay on the porch. I slid the volume bar on my phone display to the absolute maximum limit and pressed play. The pristine, flawlessly recorded audio erupted from the speaker, booming across the quiet suburban street like a thunderclap. Priscilla's voice, captured just hours prior in their townhouse, echoed against the brick facades of the neighboring homes. "Wesley, you have to call the bank manager tomorrow morning," her voice blasted, vibrating with greedy, breathless excitement. "We need to initiate the second wire transfer before the old fool even realizes he has been locked out of his own bank accounts." The sound was so loud, so completely undeniable, that Deputy Halloran physically recoiled, stepping back and dropping his hand toward his utility belt. Across the street, the silver Porsche remained entirely motionless, the driver frozen in place. The audio recording continued without mercy. Wesley's voice joined the playback, his arrogant, boastful tone, now broadcast for the entire neighborhood, and the local police to hear. "Do not worry about the bank, baby," Wesley's recorded voice echoed loudly. "The collateral is totally locked in. That idiot signed the quitclaim deed without even reading the fine print. He completely bought the tax management lie. We just secured a $2.5 million federal commercial loan using a ghost asset. And the absolute best part is, he still thinks he owns the dirt under his feet." The speaker projected the sound of crystal glasses clinking together, a sickening toast to my engineered destruction. "We bulldoze the sanctuary on Monday," Wesley's voice sneered into the morning air. "The federal money will be completely offshore by Tuesday afternoon." I stood perfectly still, watching the color rapidly drain from Deputy Halloran's face. He was not a fool. He was a sworn officer of the law, and he was currently holding an eviction notice based on the exact fraudulent document being openly discussed in the high-definition audio broadcast. The young deputy looked down at the manila folder in his hands, then looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying comprehension. He realized the paper he was holding was not a legal mandate. It was the physical instrument of a massive coordinated federal bank fraud. The patronizing pity was completely gone, replaced by the sharp, intense focus of a cop who had just stumbled into a major criminal conspiracy. He slowly reached up and unclipped the radio microphone from his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the silver Porsche. Across the street, the absolute reality of the dire situation had finally crashed down upon Wesley. The smug, victorious grin had entirely vanished from his pale face, quickly replaced by a pathetic mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what that crystal-clear audio meant for his immediate future. He knew his brilliant, foolproof corporate heist had just been broadcast directly to a uniformed police officer standing on my front porch. He had nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide his deceit, and no more fake tears to manipulate his way out of federal prison. He slammed his shaking hand against the polished gear shift, throwing the luxury sports car violently into drive. The massive engine roared to life, the expensive tires screeching loudly against the hot asphalt, as he desperately attempted to flee the scene of his own unraveling crime. But he was far too late. The irrevocable trap I had carefully constructed had already snapped firmly shut around him, sealing his complete destruction. The speaker on my porch was not finished. The digital audio file transitioned seamlessly from their arrogant financial boasting to a conversation that was infinitely darker. The sound quality was flawless, capturing the subtle acoustics of their upscale townhouse. Priscilla's voice cut through the heavy, humid morning air, crisp, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. "Once the sheriff drags him out, dump him in that cheap state facility," her voice projected, echoing against the brick facades of the surrounding homes. "Make sure to cancel his premium heart meds. He is 70, Wesley. Without the good meds, his heart will give out in a month. We keep the $2.5 million. The developers bulldoze the house, and we are free." The sheer malice of those words hung in the air, instantly suffocating the suburban tranquility. The neighborhood began to awaken. Front doors cautiously opened. Neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns, their morning routines completely forgotten as they turned their shocked faces toward my property. The cruel, undeniable reality of a daughter casually plotting her own father's demise had been broadcast for the entire street to witness. On my front porch, Deputy Halloran stood completely frozen, his eyes wide and fixed on the Bluetooth speaker hidden among my potted ferns. The manila envelope containing the fraudulent eviction notice slipped from his loosened grip, the papers scattering across the wooden floorboards. He was no longer looking at a confused, senile old man resisting a legal property transfer. He was standing face to face with the intended victim of a highly premeditated, cold-blooded conspiracy to commit murder. The young officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as the professional training took over his initial shock. He instinctively dropped his right hand to the heavy black radio, resting on his tactical belt, his fingers gripping the plastic housing. He did not need to ask me for an explanation. The evidence had just spoken for itself. Across the street, the violent roar of the silver Porsche abruptly died. In his blind panic to throw the sports car into gear and flee the unraveling crime scene, Wesley had severely miscalculated. His hand knocked against the large insulated coffee cup resting in the center console. I watched with profound, cold satisfaction as the dark liquid splashed heavily across his lap and the pristine, expensive leather interior. He dropped the cup, entirely spilling the remaining contents over the passenger seat. But Wesley did not attempt to clean the mess. He sat entirely paralyzed behind the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the leather, his eyes darting frantically toward the police officer standing on my porch. Priscilla had just emerged from the passenger side of the vehicle. The arrogant, victorious smirk she had worn just moments prior was instantly, permanently erased, as her own recorded voice detailed the exact method she planned to use to end my life. Her face drained of all color. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked like a tragic mask. The sheer suffocating terror of absolute exposure gripped her entirely. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide and fixed on me. She knew the illusion was shattered. She knew that I knew everything. There were no more lies to spin, no more fake tears to shed, and no more manipulative performances left to execute. I looked down from the elevated vantage point of my porch, observing the complete and utter devastation of the two people who had intended to bury me. For months they had treated me like a disposable nuisance, an expiring liability standing between them, and a massive financial payout. They had weaponized my grief over my late wife. They had exploited my paternal love to steal my sanctuary. And when that was not enough, they had calmly negotiated the timeline of my physical death. Hearing those words spoken aloud, confirming the darkest, most unforgivable depths of their greed, should have broken my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Instead, it solidified my resolve into impenetrable steel. I slowly stepped around the scattered eviction papers on the floorboards and walked to the edge of the wooden railing. I looked directly at Priscilla. I did not raise my voice, and I did not display any anger. I offered her nothing but the hollow, empty stare of a man who had completely severed all emotional ties. The neighborhood was dead silent, save for the static crackle of Deputy Halloran's shoulder radio, as he prepared to call for immediate backup. The morning sun continued to rise, casting long, sharp shadows across the dew-covered grass, illuminating the precise moment the predator became the prey. "Officer," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my daughter, "I believe you now have sufficient probable cause to initiate an arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, alongside the federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud they have already executed using a forged quitclaim deed." Deputy Halloran did not hesitate. He pressed the transmit button on his radio, his voice sharp, authoritative, and entirely stripped of its previous patronizing tone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need immediate backup at my current location. Priority 1. We have a confirmed 109 in progress. Suspect vehicle is a silver Porsche directly across from the target residence. Do not let that vehicle leave the perimeter." Wesley frantically twisted the ignition key, desperate to restart the stalled sports car, but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal. Priscilla remained rooted to the concrete driveway, her knees buckling slightly as the distant rising wail of approaching police sirens cut through the morning air. The carefully constructed fortress of their corporate theft was collapsing down upon them in real time. They had believed their plan was foolproof. They had assumed my old age made me a compliant, easy target. They had entirely forgotten that an engineer spends his entire life anticipating structural failures and building irrevocable traps for those who attempt to bypass the established rules. The true beauty of the trap was not just the audio recording. It was the absolute futility of their initial crime. Even if they had somehow managed to escape the driveway, even if they had successfully evaded the local police and the impending federal indictments, they still owned absolutely nothing. The irrevocable blind trust I had established years ago meant the quitclaim deed they had so carefully forged was a useless piece of paper. The $2.5 million they had stolen from the federal bank was secured against a ghost asset. They had mortgaged their entire lives, their freedom, and their future for a property they could never legally possess. The demolition crew would never arrive. The luxury retail center would never be built. I watched as the first black and white patrol cruiser turned the corner, its emergency lights flashing brilliantly against the suburban homes. It accelerated rapidly, pulling at a sharp angle to completely block the silver Porsche from the street. 2 more cruisers arrived within seconds, boxing the vehicle in from all sides. Uniformed officers spilled out, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. Deputy Halloran jogged down the steps of my porch, moving purposefully toward the driveway, where Priscilla stood paralyzed, and Wesley sat trapped in his ruined luxury car. I reached out and pressed the power button on the Bluetooth speaker, silencing the device. The air was now filled with the chaotic sounds of law enforcement taking absolute control. I turned my back on the flashing lights, the shouting officers, and the panicked tears of the woman who used to be my daughter. I walked into my quiet sanctuary and gently closed the solid oak door behind me, feeling the heavy peace of absolute justice settling over my home. I stood in the quiet hallway of my home for only a few seconds. The heavy oak door closed firmly behind me. The flashing red and blue lights pulsed through the frosted glass of the entryway, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls of my sanctuary. I had intended to let the authorities handle the rest, to wash my hands of the 2 people who had conspired to end my life. But the cold, calculating engineer inside my mind demanded a final, definitive closure. A system is not fully decommissioned until the final valve is turned and the pressure is permanently neutralized. I reached out, gripped the brass handle, and pulled the heavy door open once more. The humid Oklahoma air washed over me as I stepped back onto the wooden planks of my front porch. Deputy Halloran and 3 other heavily armed officers had already drawn their service weapons, their voices cutting through the morning humidity as they ordered Wesley out of the silver Porsche. I walked down the 3 wooden steps, my boots making a slow, deliberate sound against the concrete walkway. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing was perfectly even, and my heart beat with the steady, unyielding rhythm of a man who had reclaimed his absolute sovereignty. I walked slowly across the asphalt of the street, parting the sea of flashing police cruisers, with the quiet authority of a ghost returning from the grave. The neighborhood was entirely captivated by the unfolding spectacle. People stood on their manicured lawns wrapped in mourning robes, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, arrogant couple from the city was systematically dismantled. Wesley was pressed hard against the hood of his ruined luxury car, his hands secured behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. His face was pressed against the hot metal, his eyes wide and darting frantically like a trapped animal. He was sweating profusely, the dark coffee stains blending into the expensive fabric of his tailored trousers. But I did not look at Wesley. My gaze was fixed entirely on Priscilla. She was standing near the edge of the driveway, trembling so violently that her knees threatened to completely buckle beneath her. A female officer stood closely beside her, maintaining a firm grip on her upper arm to prevent her from collapsing onto the concrete. Priscilla looked at me, her eyes wide, pleading silently, begging for the merciful, forgiving father she had exploited for years. She expected me to intervene, to call off the wolves, to save her from the consequences of her own actions. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. The air between us felt heavy and charged with static electricity. I looked at the woman I had raised, the child I had comforted, the daughter I had loved with every fiber of my being. I searched her familiar face for any lingering trace of my late wife, but I found absolutely nothing. She was an empty vessel, entirely consumed by bottomless, ruthless greed. "You did not just try to steal my home, Priscilla," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level, carrying easily over the static of the police radios. I watched a fresh wave of tears spill over her eyelashes, streaking her immaculate makeup. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a hand. "You signed my death warrant for a couple of $1 million, I continued, my words striking her like physical blows. "You casually planned to murder your own father by deliberately cutting off my medication. You sat in my house, drank my tea, and calculated exactly how many days it would take for my heart to permanently fail without the premium prescriptions. You thought you could just dump me in a cheap state facility, wait for me to quietly expire, and then walk away completely free." A soft, choked sob escaped her lips. She tried to speak, tried to formulate a lie, but her throat was completely paralyzed by the sheer suffocating terror of my absolute awareness. Across the hood of the Porsche, Wesley began to thrash weakly against the officer's grip, shouting desperate, incoherent excuses about a misunderstanding, about corporate restructuring and temporary liquidations. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with him. The pathetic panic in his expression was the ultimate validation of my strategy. "Wesley, you always believed you were the smartest man in any room," I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure the arresting officers heard every single syllable. "You thought I was just a senile, clueless old man who blindly signed a quitclaim deed. You thought you had successfully isolated me from my own property, but you failed to conduct a basic, thorough title search. The deed you brought to my kitchen table, the document you so proudly filed with the county clerk, is entirely worthless." The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stopped struggling against the steel cuffs, his breathing hitching in his chest. "I established an irrevocable blind trust in 2018, I explained, watching with profound satisfaction as their souls seemingly left their bodies. "The property belongs entirely to the trust, managed by an independent fiduciary. My personal signature carries absolutely no legal weight to authorize a transfer of ownership. I cannot give away an asset I do not legally possess. The deed you filed is a phantom piece of paper." The devastating reality of their situation crashed over them like a massive concrete wall. They had built their entire criminal enterprise on a foundational lie. I stepped slightly closer to Wesley, leaning in so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "Do you understand what that means for your commercial loan, Wesley?" I asked softly. "You walked into a federally insured bank and used a void, completely fabricated document to secure a $2.5 million cash wire transfer. You collateralized an asset you legally cannot own and you can never possess. The money sitting in your offshore holding account is entirely unsecured. The bank holds no actual leverage on this property. You did not just execute a simple family fraud. You just committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud." The crushing finality of my words hung heavily in the humid morning air. Wesley's legs finally gave out, his knees buckling as he slumped against the side of the police cruiser, held upright only by the firm grip of the arresting officers. Priscilla buried her face in her hands, releasing a loud, agonizing wail of pure, unadulterated despair. I had deliberately let them proceed with their fake eviction, allowing them to confidently present their forged documents to local law enforcement, perfectly guaranteeing the federal authorities possessed an absolutely airtight, irrefutable case of malicious criminal intent. I stood in the bright Oklahoma sunlight, a lone wolf who had successfully defended his sanctuary, watching quietly as the flashing police cruisers carried the remnants of my broken family away forever. The neighborhood remained hushed, bearing solemn witness to the absolute ruin of two people who had so recklessly tried to annihilate mine. The local police cruisers had barely begun to secure the perimeter when the true magnitude of my retaliation finally descended upon the neighborhood. My vision of them being carried away by local authorities was instantly interrupted by a sound that shook the very pavement beneath my feet. Before Wesley could even attempt a final desperate dash toward the open door of his silver Porsche to somehow escape the grasp of Deputy Halloran, the deep guttural roar of heavy high-performance engines shattered the lingering morning silence. Three massive, completely black, unmarked sport utility vehicles screeched violently around the corner of the suburban street, tearing through the quiet residential atmosphere. Their thick tires smoked and squealed loudly against the asphalt as they executed a perfectly synchronized, highly tactical blockade. They formed an impenetrable solid wall of dark steel and tinted glass, completely sealing off the street and trapping Wesley and Priscilla inside a highly coordinated federal net. The doors of the heavy vehicles flew open simultaneously, and a dozen heavily armed federal agents stepped out into the thick, humid Oklahoma air. They moved with a terrifying silent efficiency, their boots hitting the ground in unison, wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The potent smell of burned rubber drifted across the manicured lawns, permanently replacing the tranquil scent of morning dew. Leading the federal detachment was Frank Delgado. My seasoned litigation attorney stepped out of the lead vehicle, his immaculate suit providing a stark contrast to the heavy tactical gear surrounding him. He adjusted his tie and looked up at my porch, giving me a single crisp nod of confirmation. The elaborate trap we had meticulously built in his downtown office had been perfectly sprung. Two large federal agents immediately descended upon Wesley. The local deputies wisely stepped back, surrendering their jurisdiction to the overwhelming federal presence without a single word of protest. Wesley let out a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure panic as the agents grabbed him firmly by the shoulders. He desperately tried to squirm, his expensive Italian loafers slipping wildly on the wet concrete where his spilled coffee had pooled. He was roughly spun around and slammed forcefully against the hood of his own silver Porsche. The heavy impact violently dented the pristine customized metal, serving as a fitting, poetic metaphor for the sudden destruction of his carefully curated life. Wesley Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit massive federal bank fraud, aggravated wire fraud, and the attempted extortion of a federally insured financial institution, the lead agent announced, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority as he began reciting the Miranda warnings. The cold, metallic click of heavy federal handcuffs, snapping tightly shut around Wesley's wrists, echoed clearly across the silent neighborhood. Wesley pressed his cheek against the hot metal of his ruined sports car, his eyes wide and completely vacant, finally processing the absolute certainty that his entire life was over. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive holding a fraudulent deed. He was a federal inmate bound for a maximum security penitentiary. Priscilla stood paralyzed on the edge of the driveway, witnessing the complete and total annihilation of her husband and her stolen future. The federal agents did not ignore her involvement in the conspiracy. A tall, stern female agent approached her, producing a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. The shiny sight of the restraining devices finally broke through Priscilla's profound state of shock. The cold, calculating predator, who had callously discussed my demise just hours prior, completely vanished. She collapsed entirely, her knees hitting the rough, hard asphalt with a sickening thud that tore the fabric of her expensive designer trousers. The sheer suffocating terror of her new, inescapable reality entirely consumed her. She began to sob hysterically, a raw, ugly sound that tore through her throat as she looked up at me, standing firmly on the elevated porch. "Daddy, please!" she screamed, her voice cracking with wild, unrestrained desperation that echoed down the block, drawing the horrified stares of dozens of neighborhood residents. "Please, you have to stop them right now. Tell them it is a terrible mistake. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. Please do not let them take me away from my home." Her expensive makeup was a ruined, smeared mess across her pale face. She reached her trembling hands toward me, clutching at the empty air, begging for the paternal mercy she had so ruthlessly exploited and deliberately discarded. She expected the man who had loved her, the man who had protected her for her entire life, to somehow step down from the porch and permanently shield her from the devastating legal consequences of her own horrific actions. I did not take a single step off the wooden porch. I did not soften my rigid posture, and I absolutely did not offer her a single ounce of comfort or reassurance. I looked down at her, from my reclaimed sanctuary, my face an absolute mask of zero emotion. The generous, loving father she had once known, the vulnerable older man she thought she could so easily manipulate and eventually murder in a state facility, was completely and permanently gone. I stared intensely into her pleading, terrified eyes, feeling nothing inside but a profound, chilling, and permanent emptiness. My little girl died the exact moment she decided my life was worth far less than a luxury vacation and a beachfront property, I said, my voice projecting across the manicured lawn, perfectly cold, flat, and carrying the heavy, inescapable weight of an absolute final judgment. Enjoy your new life in federal prison. The harsh words struck her with the devastating force of a physical blow. She gasped, her mouth falling open, as the female agent firmly grabbed her arms and pulled them behind her back. The steel cuffs clicked into place, securing my daughter in the harsh, unforgiving grip of federal justice. I did not stay to watch the rest of the miserable spectacle unfold in my driveway. I turned my back on the flashing lights, the heavily armed agents, and the pathetic echoing screams of the woman who had tried to bury me. I walked slowly across the wooden planks of my porch, my boots stepping over the scattered, worthless eviction papers that had blown across the floorboards like dead leaves. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of my front door, and stepped back into the quiet, cool sanctuary of my home. I pushed the solid oak door shut behind me, locking them out. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed with a deep, satisfying finality. The chaotic noise of the street outside was instantly muted, replaced by the profound, comforting silence of a house that belonged entirely to me. I walked deliberately toward the comforting warmth of my private study, my footsteps steady and resolute, leaving the betrayal behind. I poured myself a final, generous measure of aged bourbon, raised the heavy crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the loving memory of my late wife, and finally tasted the sweet, burning flavor of absolute permanent victory. The taste of that aged bourbon marked the definitive end of my vulnerability and the beginning of a radically different chapter in my life. 6 months passed since that chaotic morning on my front porch, and the wheels of federal justice turned with a slow, grinding, and absolutely merciless efficiency. I did not attend their trial. I had no desire to sit in a sterile federal courtroom and watch the two people who had planned my demise attempt to play the victims. Instead, I watched the spectacular collapse of their lives from the quiet comfort of my study. following the relentless coverage on the evening news broadcasts. The media descended upon the story with a ravenous appetite. It was, after all, a perfect modern tragedy of corporate greed, family betrayal, and spectacular hubris. The financial reporters detailed every single aspect of Wesley's incredibly arrogant scheme. They meticulously explained how he had forged my signature, bypassed the commercial lending protocols, and attempted to launder $2.5 million through his offshore shell companies. The federal prosecutors were absolutely ruthless in their presentation of the evidence. They played the audio recording from the hidden microbug in open court, broadcasting Priscilla's cold, calculated plan to cancel my heart medication to a jury of her horrified peers. The entire courtroom reportedly sat in a stunned, deafening silence as her cruel recorded laughter echoed off the wood-paneled walls. There was no defense strategy capable of overcoming the sound of a daughter actively anticipating her father's lethal cardiac arrest. Wesley's high-priced defense attorneys scrambled uselessly, completely unable to dismantle the meticulous paper trail of their fraudulent offshore accounts and the undeniable reality of the void quitclaim deed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The presiding federal judge handed down consecutive maximum sentences for the aggravated bank fraud, the wire fraud, and the criminal conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Wesley and Priscilla were each condemned to serve 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of any possibility for early parole. But the criminal sentences were only the beginning of their absolute ruin. The federally insured commercial bank, desperate to recover the massive capital Wesley had recklessly stolen and rapidly dispersed, initiated a total and immediate asset seizure. The bank's litigation team moved with a vicious speed that made Wesley's initial eviction attempt look like child's play. They completely liquidated his corporate accounts. They seized the custom silver Porsche that was sitting impounded in a police lot. They foreclosed on their immaculate upscale townhouse, legally auctioning off every single piece of designer furniture, every expensive piece of jewelry, and every limited edition Prada handbag Priscilla had ever collected. They were reduced to absolute staggering poverty, forced to trade their lives of manufactured luxury for standard-issue canvas uniforms and the bleak concrete walls of federal lockup. They had gambled their entire existence for a few $1 million, and they had lost absolutely everything. With my predators securely locked away behind reinforced steel doors, I turned my attention back to the 5-acre estate that had been the epicenter of this brutal war. The sprawling property had successfully served its final purpose. The irrevocable blind trust had acted as an impenetrable fortress, perfectly shielding the land from their predatory grasp while simultaneously trapping them in a massive federal crime. However, walking through the quiet, empty halls of the house, I realized the atmosphere had permanently shifted. The beautiful sanctuary I had built with my late wife was now irrevocably tainted by the lingering memory of Priscilla's profound betrayal. The walls echoed with the phantom sound of her cruel calculations. I no longer wished to spend my remaining years walking the same floorboards where my own daughter had confidently plotted my murder. Operating within the legal parameters of the trust I had personally architected, I instructed Frank Delgado to legally dissolve the structural restrictions and prepare the property for immediate liquidation. I had no interest in selling to another ruthless corporate entity like Thorn Holdings. Instead, I meticulously vetted potential buyers, eventually selecting a highly respected, ethical development firm out of Halloway that specialized in sustainable community-focused residential projects. They recognized the immense inherent value of the premium suburban acreage and offered a completely clean, immediate cash transaction. I finalized the sale of the 5-acre estate for a staggering $5 million. I signed the legitimate binding closing documents in Delgado's downtown office, a stark poetic contrast to the fraudulent paperwork Wesley had tried to force upon me in my kitchen. I took the substantial capital from the sale, combined it with my already comfortable retirement savings, and permanently turned my back on the state of Oklahoma. I desired a complete geographical and psychological separation from the darkest chapter of my life. I traveled south, ultimately purchasing a breathtaking ultra-modern penthouse condominium situated high above the vibrant sun-drenched coastline of Coral Vista, Florida. The stark, brilliant white walls and floor-to-ceiling glass panels of my new residence offered an uninterrupted panoramic view of the vast, glittering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The heavy, oppressive shadows of my old study were permanently replaced by the bright, restorative energy of the tropical sun. The physical transformation I underwent in those subsequent months was nothing short of remarkable. The frail, disheveled, cognitively declining old man I had pretended to be was completely banished. I returned to my rigorous daily exercise routines. I ate exceptionally well. My posture straightened. My mind remained razor-sharp, and my heart beat with a vibrant, unyielding vitality. The sea salt breeze flowing through my open balcony doors felt like a daily baptism, washing away the bitter residue of the past. I had successfully excised a malignant cancerous tumor from my life, and the resulting sense of freedom was utterly intoxicating. Yet my definitive victory required one final constructive act. The sheer cruelty of Priscilla's plan to cancel my premium medications had left a profound impression upon me. I could not simply forget the chilling reality that countless elderly individuals actually suffered and died because they were unable to afford their life-saving prescriptions. I took a significant portion of the profits from the estate sale and formally established a highly endowed medical charity in the loving, honorable memory of my late wife. The foundation was specifically designed to provide direct financial assistance to vulnerable elderly patients, ensuring they never had to choose between their fundamental survival and their basic financial dignity. Every time the charity approved a grant to cover a vital cardiac prescription, I felt a deep, resonant sense of vindication. I had taken the exact weapon Priscilla intended to use against me and transformed it into an instrument of profound healing for thousands of strangers. I stood alone on my expansive glass balcony, the warm Coral Vista wind pulling at my tailored linen shirt, watching the majestic ocean tide roll relentlessly toward the white sand beach. I raised a glass of sparkling mineral water toward the endless blue horizon, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle deeply into my bones. I had faced the absolute worst aspects of human nature harbored within my own bloodline, and I had completely neutralized the threat. I had protected my sanctuary, defended my legacy, and taken absolute control of my own narrative. I had won the war. Sometimes the most dangerous predators don't break into your house through the window. They have keys to the front door and call you family. Society teaches us to forgive our children unconditionally, but there is a profound difference between a mistake and a calculated crime. Forgiveness is a virtue, but protecting your life, your dignity, and your hard-earned legacy is a duty. Never hand over the keys to your survival to anyone. You can love your family, but you must love yourself enough to walk away and let the law handle those who wear the mask of a demon. If Nathaniel's cold, calculated revenge sent chills down your spine, hit that like button right now. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories of ultimate justice.